All right, guys. So this is going to be a very bare bones, uh, only basics kind of quick start video for V-Ray 5 for Rhino. Before we start, I just want to point out that the Chaos Group kind of website, V-Ray 5 for Rhino Help, right? If you make an account with them and log in, all these resources are here, right? So if you kind of need help, need a guide for installation or what some settings mean, lights, materials, like there's a lot of documentation here, particularly user interface where things are. You can find all of this here, all right? They do have some coursework, but these are kind of for earlier versions, 3.0, 3.x, and V-Ray Next, which is basically V-Ray 4. So the newest version, Read 5, there's some videos, but they're not like set in a courseware kind of format just yet. It's mostly in kind of like what's new kind of webinars. So I'm going to just cover some of the basics and mostly I would say the differences between the newer version and the older version. So if you have V-Ray installed, you should get these toolbars. I usually don't use these separately, just kind of, you can close these smaller ones, just have this V-Ray all, right, floating around somewhere, if that's kind of more convenient, or you can just use things down here from the pull down menu, right? These are the same. If you ever lose these toolbars, you can right click anywhere here, go to show toolbar, scroll down probably to the very bottom, and you'll find all the V-Ray toolbars, and you can bring them back by right clicking on the tick marks, right? Okay. Okay, so first, the main thing you're interfacing with in V-Ray, of course, is the V-Ray asset editor. When you bring it in, it should look like this. Just kind of remind you that there are two pull-out arrows, right? Pull-out tabs on each side. There are tiny little arrows right here and here that you click on to pull out all the optional settings, okay? Um, when we come in, these should be kind of collapsed, right? And generally, this is up the top. These are the kind of different panels that you'll be working with. This is the frame buffer, which is the window, right, in which V-Ray renders. This is the render button. There are several options here. This is the normal, right, standalone single frame render. This is the interactive mode, right, which basically renders in real time what you're seeing in your viewport, right? So if you change things, you move around, this will update. V-Ray Cloud or Chaos Cloud, if you're kind of rendering up there, or export it as a scene file. So kind of ignore that. The other things here, like if you have textures in the scene, then this is where it would show up. If you have, or we'll kind of talk about this a little bit later, render elements that you want to add. These are material ID passes or Z depth passes that get rendered at the same time. Geometries, these are V-Ray specific geometries, and lights. Okay, that's kind of mostly it. This is for creating new materials. All right, most of your stuff is going to happen here. Now, out of the box, by default, if you open this file, which is provided to you right on canvas, by default, if I just do a normal CPU render, this is kind of what it looks like, right? Gray, weird bitmap background. Okay. Now, this is still running, right? And you'll see that I have several options here, right? You guys will have to kind of choose and decide or kind of see what options are available to you depending on your laptop or your computer, right? The basic everyone should have, obviously, is the CPU render. If you have a NVIDIA graphics card, I think AMD as well, then you have the CUDA option. If you have a newer AMD graphics card that supports ray tracing, right? So these are the GTXs, these are the RTXs that supports ray tracing, then you will have a ray tracing option. The little dots actually allow you to choose graphics cards or what you're using to accelerate things, as well as up here under V-Ray, somewhere here, tools, probably GPU device selection. If you click on that, it will run a little script, and what it will show you is the whatever GPUs are available right on your computer. Now, many of you have laptops that have the discrete GPU, right? And a onboard GPU like this, that's kind of part of the CPU. Make sure that you're using your GPU, the beefy one, right? Something like this. In this case, mine is a 3070, okay? Um, make sure it's using that because the onboard graphics aren't going to be worth anything in this context, okay? All right, now, I'm gonna do the first couple tests. I'm gonna do it by CPU, right? But eventually, when I move to larger renderings, I'm gonna change to my RTX because it's gonna be a lot faster. But just to kind of show you what the CPU experience might be like, I'm gonna do this. Quality down here for test renderings, I would just do something like low plus, right? We're just trying to get a sense of like what it looks like without looking too much at details. So I would change this for now, but for production renderings, I would at least go to medium. If you think you have time, you can go to medium plus or high, but these will drastically increase the render time, right? So in most cases, unless your geometry is really intricate, or you're seeing weird errors pop up, medium probably is going to be fine for the most part. Make sure to turn on the denoiser. This is something that's really helpful in making the renderings look smoother. If you have a CPU, then you'll be stuck with the V-Ray version. If you have a GPU and you have CUDA and RTX kind of options available to you, then I would change it to this, the NVIDIA AI, because this will be faster as well. Camera, we'll talk about later, but make sure render output, right? Keep these small. So right now, render output, the image size, I'm just using 800 by 450, which is 16 by 9 widescreen. If you want, you can match it to your viewport size as well, just so that like whatever viewport you're looking at is actually what you get in your end renderings. Okay, so there are some options here that you can kind of change. All right. So as we can see here, right, that's kind of like that. And so what I want to do here is, let's say we're looking at this from exterior point of view, is to one thing first here, environment, right? Now, this is a concept that's going to be tricky at first to understand, that here in V-Ray, right, the environment right now, besides being the background for things, also illuminates the scene. Okay, there's a second thing here where your Rhino document sun, which is kind of in here by default, also will change the scene lighting. Okay, now I'm gonna go back here and change my rendering mode into interactive, so you can kind of see what I'm talking about. So interactive mode does this, right? Again, if I move my viewport, then the rendering updates. Okay, so I'm going to set this back to the exterior view here. Right, so it updates, right? Now, I will go over here to the lights tab, right? And I turn on the Rhino document set, and you'll see it brings in basically a second source of light, right? This light is coming from the Rhino document set. If I turn this off, that disappears, okay? If I go back to my settings and go to environment, right? And if I uncheck this, turning the environment light off, then it goes pitch black, right? So these are kind of two separate light sources, right? So I turn this on, you'll see, okay, there's no background whatsoever, right? There's no environment background or lighting. So this is all coming from the sun. So this is the kind of thing that often catches people off guard, right? Like these two light sources exist kind of simultaneously. All right. I don't like this background because it's a weird bitmap, right? So I'm going to click on this little checker box texture slot, which will bring me into here. And this is actually the bitmap that's being applied as a dome, right, in my environment right now, right? So it's in a kind of like 360 view. There are a lot of things you can do here, but for now, right, if you click on here on the very left where the checker box is, replaced with new texture, then you'll see I have a lot of options, right? And just to kind of show you, I can change this, for example, to color, right? Again, because the color is black, so it becomes pitch black, but I can click here in the color box and change the color, and so I can make it something more close to white here. Then you'll see, right, it starts to illuminate the scene again, right? And this is white, pure white, so it's a little gray. You can kind of use sometimes for lighting, right? Instead I use this Kelvin meter, right? the color temperature meter down here, and you can go from warmer colors, right, or to red, right, to more bluer colors, right, to use that as a way to kind of control the color temperature of your lighting, right? So that's if your background was a solid color fill, right? And again, right, I can go into the environment, right, and kind of turn this off, it goes away. Or you'll see here, under here, there's a GI slot, which is global illumination, right? The global illumination slot here also will control this color, right? So again, right, this. And what you'll see is this, right? And this is the point. One is that my texture background my bitmap or so color background I did was blue, right? But my GI here, global illumination slot here is red or yellowish, right? And that's why the things that are in a scene, right, are kind of taking on the yellow color, right? And this is separate from the background color, right? These are different things. If this slot is enabled, then these are different things. Okay, but if I disable it, then it's actually just using this blue color that I picked, right, as the illumination color. Okay, all right. Now, I don't want to do a color. I actually want to be a bit more realistic. So I'm going to click here, right, and out of all the different kind of options, I'm actually going to just pick the sky. So the sky is actually going to use a actual sky model, right? And at first it will look really blown out, right? It will just look like white. So what you do is you just bump down the intensity to something like 0.1 or so. It doesn't have to be super accurate, but 0.1, whatever. And you'll see that in the refresh, in the interactive rendering, it starts to kind of, okay, you know, there's a sort of sky, there's a sun, et cetera, right? You can play with the different sky models that kind of give you slightly different looks. This improved sky model is the newest V-Ray. This model is new in V-Ray 5, so you can play with that. Apparently, it kind of works pretty well with a lot of different situations, so you can play with this. And you can tweak the intensity, right, to see how bright. In this case, for now, I'm really just looking at the background, right? Because right now I'm just really tweaking the background, knowing that I'm going to possibly bring in the sun later, right? But if the kind of rendering look that you want is like this, right? And if I kind of zoom in, you'll see the shadows are kind of more diffuse, right? Then I would basically kind of adjust this multiplier to a point where like the lighting in the scene is kind of what you want, right? And that's the rendering, right? This is kind of more diffuse style, right, of rendering. Another thing to remember is besides that, to come back into the camera, right, and tweak your exposure value for this. And you'll see this basically similar to exposure in cameras, right? Changes the light sensitivity, right? And so this is also a second way, right? Besides changing the light source itself, which, you know, typically once we develop a scene for lighting, then we just want to leave it there, right? We don't want to have to like tweak light all the time. And so the exposure value is the thing that, the single thing that you would change, right? To kind of make your renderings generally brighter or darker. So, in this case, let's say, for example, you know, 11 is a little dark, 10, kind of okay, you know, 9, too bright. So maybe 9.5. Okay, and I will call that, right, for a diffuse rendering, right? Pretty decent, okay? Again, let me set my view back to the sort of exterior view like this, right? And if you say, okay, well, that looks okay, and I want to kind of see what the final rendering looks like, then you can stop the interactive render, right? And change this to the normal render, okay? But before that, I'm going to switch to my RTX. So it's going to be a little bit faster, right? And I'm going to click on the render with V-Ray. All right. Now, usually the first time you run an RTX rendering, like there's gonna sometimes, right, there's gonna be a startup phase where it says it's kind of compiling sort of optics kernels, and that'll take a little while, maybe a minute or two. That's fine, right? Both of these options, the CUDA and the RTX option, have an initialization phase for the very first time. But so once it's done, then it runs through this really quick, right? Second thing, that was a quick one, so I'll go down here to the render output and change this to 2000 pixels and kind of run that again. So now you'll get a bigger screen preview, and you'll kind of see how it kind of progressively works through, right, to render out the image. If you're on the CPU, then your buckets, your little kind of buckets are going to be a lot smaller, right? If you're on a GPU, then it might be fast like mine, and depending on the speed of your GPU. It's still kind of going through a pass-through, right? Although it looks like it's kind of almost done, it's still kind of doing the details and kind of doing the AI smoothing, etc. And now I think it's close to complete. Now it's done. All right. So this is rendered out in the V-Ray frame buffer. You can kind of change the size, zoom in, zoom out, right? Check details, things like that, whatever. Okay. And if you want to, then you just save, right, the current channel. Right now, there are different channels like RGB and alpha channel, which allows you to use this to cut out the sun or the background if you want to, the sky, and slide in your own, right? So these can be saved separately. So that's why these operands are here. Save all image channels to separate files, save to single, which means that when you bring this into Photoshop, all of these channels will be in the same file, which can be very useful. Okay. So I'm going to turn this on, right? If you want to save current channel and just save it as a JPEG or whatever kind of file format, right? PNG, these are all formats you can kind of save as. Okay. All right, that goes through kind of saving images in the V-Ray kind of frame buffer, or the VFB, as we kind of call it. All right. Now, that was kind of showing you guys the difference between the environment channel and the GI that the environment channel kind of brings in. But let's say I want to use the Rhino document sun. All right. So I'm going to, again, switch back my render output to something smaller, like 800, like before, and switch it back to the interactive rendering. Okay. So just like before, and make this window a little bit more manageable here, so we can kind of see things side by side. Okay, so all right, the backgrounds, using the sky as the background, right? Again, when you click in, you can kind of change these things, right? You'll see this custom orientation thing here. In some ways, it's kind of not that useful in the background. You can kind of change the orientation of it, which means like the bitmap kind of gets spun around, right? So you'll see the background color change a little bit if you like, for whatever reason, like the sun just kind of there, or you can kind of change this, which actually kind of changes the height of the sun and the intensity, right? So the bitmap up here gives you a kind of decent sense of what's happening. Okay. But for a background image, like I usually don't kind of really use that too much. This is much more useful for the sun. Okay. So again, if I go to the sun, the Rhino document sun, and turn it on, then you'll see, actually one thing here I noticed with this sometimes is that you want to try to manipulate this into a place where it's not trying to resolve all the time. So I'm gonna mess with this a little bit. Or if that happens, just kind of redo this thing, change it to color, and then bring back the sky again. Okay. Yeah, sometimes that'll happen that it'll just like continually, kind of try to resolve and resolve. And, so if that happens, just kind of redo it. Okay. All right. Now, again, let me tweak this really quickly because my sort of intensity for the background is a little bit too high. I want to kind of bring it down so I can kind of like, see, right, the sky that I have. Improved. Okay. And these actually, you can change, or these kind of change like the fogginess, and all of these are things that modify the way the sky looks. So I'm not going to go too much into that right now. Lights. So let me turn on the Rhino document sun, and you'll see, okay, this version, right, with the sun is with basically kind of really sharp shadows, right? So click on the Rhino document sun, right? Let's click here, click on the Rhino document sun. Clicking here activates or deactivates it. These are kind of sharp shadows, right? Now this here, again, can play with the intensity, right? To see kind of how bright, how dark it is, right? So this is more useful here. Orientation here then starts to dictate, right, the height of the sun, as well as the orientation, the direction of the shadows, right? So changing these will kind of change the scene. Now, you will find that as you change this, right, you may have to come back into the settings here, right, and change the exposure value, right, to kind of bring it down. If you get this continually, then just kind of stop the interactive rendering, and for now I'll just kind of maybe go back to the CPU version because it usually has a little bit less issues with that, and it's for a preview rendering it's like just as fast. Okay, here, and so we'll look at that. If as I kind of adjust this, right, and you can see the orientation change in the shadows, right? So I can kind of maybe tweak this so the shadows are kind of what I want, right, in this sort of view, right? Again, you can kind of change the intensity, but just remember that changing the intensity, you have to kind of balance it off of the exposure value, right, that we're setting up here. So that's kind of maybe too bright, 11. That's kind of maybe okay, 11.5, right? Something like that, right? That reflects a little bit the color of the sun, right? Right now, this is because the sun is low, so it's starting to take on a little bit of like a reddish orange tinge. If you don't like that look, of course, you can kind of play with these. These will kind of all do slightly different things. Clear, overcast, and again, these will blow it out, so you have to change your camera exposure value again. Okay, so let's say that's kind of okay. I want to point out one thing here is that in this file, what you'll see, if I kind of hide these temporarily, what you'll see is that I have a giant disk here, right? And it's on a locked layer. This is a ground that I usually kind of sometimes do for this kind of stuff, right? Now, if this isn't here, what you'll see is like it's kind of floating, right, in the middle of nowhere. And this is actually literally, let me try to get a good view of this. This is actually literally the wrapped bitmap of the environment that we have in here, right? So that's literally this, right? That's why the bottom of it is brown like this, the top is like that, right? Which is the blue sky, okay? Now, there is, if you click on geometry, okay, there is a Rhino document ground plane that you can bring in, right, which is essentially an infinite ground plane. Okay, so in some cases this might be fine, right? Like this basically would be a ground plane. The only difference is that the infinite ground plane here, the Rhino document ground plane, which actually is the same thing as the V-Ray infinite plane that you can put in as well, they kind of do the same thing, is by default white, and you can't apply any textures to it. So in a case where like, oh, I actually need my ground to be ashpal or texture, then I use something like this, right? Which is this big disk, right? Which kind of gives you a very similar horizon line. You just have to make sure it's big enough, right? So that you don't see the curvature, right? And in this case, then I can apply a kind of like a material to it, right? Or give it a color as opposed to just being white, which is what the infinite ground plane would be, okay? So that's just something to kind of keep in mind. I'm gonna turn it off. So I'm just using my ground plane here, right? Second thing is that when I bring, when we brought in the geometry, or basically this is Rhino, right? I kind of had Rhino materials already applied to some of these things, right? And so it does kind of respect the basic colors of Rhino materials. So things that you bring in that already kind of have Rhino things applied to them, it will use them, okay? But for efficiency, honestly, for most materials, you will want to apply a native V-Ray material. I'm not going to touch on that in this video. We'll have a separate material video, but just kind of understand or know that. Look at the glass. Right, this is the default Rhino glass. So at 25%, it's just blue glass from Rhino. Okay. Now V-Ray has a lot of glasses, and I know glass is something we're going to use a lot. One very, very, very important point or caveat here I want to say is that you want to avoid generally most of these glasses, the fancy glasses that V-Ray has, because they're kind of meant for small objects like glass vases and things like that, to calculate really complex refractions and reflections. And so they're very computationally heavy. So they'll take a lot of time to really calculate. For our purposes, for architecture, right, and for buildings and basically generic plate glass, right, the two you use is the basic glass and the glass window neutral. These are probably the two that I would suggest you use. And you can work off of this, or even like the glass window, these, right, these are generally tend to be simpler glasses if you need a color. Any of these you can modify as well, right? So generally for glass, we just kind of need a sense of a plane there, right? And another note besides that, and actually I'm just going to add this to the scene, right? So it will come in behind my geometry tab. Again, color you can change here. If you click on this and change, then this entire thing will change color, right? So all of these are actually very, very similar. So I can click on things. For example, these are my glass panes in the Rhino, right? So I can click on it and right click here, apply to selection, right? You can also apply to layer and just apply it to the glass layer, for example, okay? Now, one thing about glass and V-Ray though, is generally for these glasses to operate correctly, they need to have thickness. If you have a single surface that you're using as a glass plane, what it'll do is it'll render out black, right? Because I think V-Ray uses this to kind of calculate refraction. And so glass surfaces need to have thickness for the refraction to work. Otherwise it goes into a single surface and never comes out. It's like a black hole, okay? So glass, if you're using these materials, need to have thickness. Just remember that. So this, again, I'll just apply to layer to my glass layer. So the V-Ray material is now applied to that. And you'll see in the Rhino layer kind of display, right? You'll see it now has that window neutral material on it too. Okay, so change the look of our windows, right? And so this is a bit more realistic or bit more kind of closer to reality in the sort of glass simulation. So V-Ray materials are always going to be better than Rhino materials in terms of accuracy and adjustability. So there's so many things you can change here, right, that I won't get into here, right? So I just want to kind of like touch upon that, make sure. And these guys are kind of on the bottom, the polycarbonate glass, these glass window ones are ones that will calculate faster for you in general, particularly for buildings where there's a lot of glass. Okay. All right, so we're, let's say, kind of happy with this, right? You can see, sharp shadows with the V-Ray sun or with the Rhino document sun, right? The size multiplier basically makes the shadows fuzzier. So I make this kind of really, really big. it should, right? Although it kind of depends on these kind of geometries don't show it as much unless you kind of have a lot of fine geometry. It will make kind of the edges fuzzier essentially, but you can kind of play with that a little bit. Okay, so I'm happy with this, right? So let me stop right here. I can stop the rendering here and change, go back to my settings, change this back to 2000, for example, right? I'm going to activate my RTX and do a normal render. Medium settings, okay, great. So maximize that. You'll see it's kind of running pretty fast, right? And so this is kind of version, right, where is sharp shadows, right, not diffuse for an exterior rendering. And exterior rendering generally, like it's finished, exterior rendering generally will run really quick, right? Just because enough light, the more light there is, the faster these renderings resolve. Okay, right, save it, blah blah. You can do all that sort of stuff. Okay, switching back to GPU, CPU. Now that's external, right? And the part of the assignment here as well is to make a sub D, right, sculpture of your own and plop it in here. So I'm actually going to take one of these wire networks that I made beforehand from Rhino and copy paste it in here. Oh, that's a little small. So I'm going to kind of pull it out and reselect this. And I'm going to scale it up by whatever. Let's do something like that, maybe slightly larger. All right, that feels maybe 0.8, slightly small. Okay, I'm going to take this, kind of plop it in the center somewhere, and multi-pipe it. Multi-pipe. I don't know radius. Let's see. I'll have to try something. I'm not too sure about the scene scale here. Happens on. Oh, that's way too fat. So let's see, 3. 2. Okay. So that's my sub D sculpture, right? I can maybe rotate it so it looks like it's sitting a little bit better, right? But you kind of get the gist. Okay. And you can, of course, modify this, play with the sub D things that we've been kind of learning a little bit. All right. And let me set this viewpoint back to exterior so it's kind of in the foreground, right? Now, another material, so part of the kind of premise here is that I want you guys to find and try, perhaps, some of these car paints. Apply this to the sub D sculpture and kind of see what it looks like. Let's maybe play with this a little bit and you'll see, let's say, if it's really fast and kind of easy to experiment with. So I'm going to start the interactive rendering again. So you'll see the sculpture in there. All right. And let's just select it. Let's play, for example, I like this sort of red, this wine red. So I'm going to add this to the scene. You can also just directly apply to selection, right? Because I have it selected right now. If the V-Ray frame buffer disappears, click down here, like it should have its own window right here. So you can see directly right away, right, that kind of taking effect. Okay. Or, maybe something a bit more glossy. So you can try the metals here, right? So some of these metals, polished aluminum, these are brushed, blurry, right? So you can kind of try some of these. Let's try something pretty shiny. Steel polished, silver polished. All right, apply to selection. Check, whoops. Check the V-Ray frame buffer, right? So it starts to come out over there. Okay. Yeah, so just kind of play with these. Find one that you like, and just apply it as a very shiny material to it. If you want to do gold or actually copper polished, apply to selection. Right. Now these are just previews. When you kind of do the actual rendering, you'll see that the quality of the reflections and everything will get bumped up a notch, right? But you can kind of really easy and applying materials, you can actually just like say, okay, this one, right? You can actually drag and drop them onto geometry in the scene like this as well, right? Or you can drag and drop them into layers and let go, but I'm not going to do that because it's going to kind of replace some of those layers, right? So both of those methods actually will work. The reframe buffer, okay. So I'm going to go with wine red. I'm going to stop this and go back again, right? Change this to something bigger, 2000. All right. Activate my GPU rendering and just render that again. So this is a 2000 render. So you'll see, right, the shinier kind of specular highlights of it, of the sub D sculpture, right? So this is exterior, right? This is kind of what we're asking you for. Finished. All right, save that, and that's it. That's that. Okay, great. Now, I'm going to kind of switch to the interiors, which are trickier, but just to kind of show you a couple of shortcuts. So if you switch the view to the set view interior 1, all right, this is kind of what it's going to look like. And I usually for this, I have to change this to wireframe so we don't kind of like accidentally select weird stuff when we're kind of doing things. And again, right, the rendering's done. Come back here, change this back to something small for test rendering purposes. Change this to low if your computer is slower. Mine is fine at medium, and do an interactive rendering. All right, so what do we see here? I actually accidentally, in this case, sort of tweaked our orientation just right. So like the sun is actually coming in, but that may not be your case. Let me try to see if we can put these side by side. And let me turn off this just so it's not in the way. So I kind of changed some of these things. So you'll see, for example, hold on. Why the V-Ray frame buffer keeps going into the background, but let me see if I can do this. Okay, anyways. So the interior scene actually looks sort of semi reasonable at the moment, right? Just because I kind of happen to get the orientation right. But if you're kind of changing the Rhino document sun orientation, then that's kind of like what I would be looking at. Let me see if I can minimize this so you guys can see this as I'm working with it. Right now it's not cooperating. Okay, so here, that's maybe a little bit better. Okay, so as you can see, screen real estate is at a premium here. So as I change this, particularly the orientation, right? Let's say this is kind of the angle I was at, but if I'm changing this to something like, let's say over here. Rhino document sun. You'll see that, right? For example, oh, darn it, I'm gonna go back to CPU. Sometimes it just does this. Okay. The GPU is faster, but sometimes it can run into weird situations. Here you go. So if you have your sun in the wrong orientation like this, right, you'll see like in this interior scene is really dark, none of the light is coming in, right? So if it's that angle, or let's say if it's this angle, for example, right, like the sun is basically behind us and none of the diffuse light is, well, none of the direct rays are coming in, it's only diffuse light, right? So there's not much light really coming in and it's very dark. And you see it's very grainy because it takes a long time to resolve, right? For an interior scene like this. And you don't want that, right? So part of it is also just saying, okay, well, let's try to adjust the sun angle, right? So you get some light, nice light coming in, and you can kind of tweak the height, right? This way interactively to get a pretty good sense of, okay, I have enough light coming in, right? And it's starting to kind of bounce right off the sides of the walls, right? So that's kind of part of the battle, right? Now, if you're going to rely on this solely, right, the renderings are going to take longer, right, and things are kind of pretty dark. Of course, you can come over here to the exposure, right, and tweak this, right? So that's dark. If I make that, then I can make the interior brighter, but what you'll see is that it will blow out the window, right? The window is gonna, the scene outside is gonna blow out just like it would in a normal camera. Now, some people will actually do this where they do a exposure rendering at this exposure level and then do a rendering at this exposure level and combine them just like as a high dynamic HDRI, a high dynamic range image, right? And to kind of keep this like outside beam, right? Now I would show, I'm going to kind of show a sort of shortcut here in terms of dealing with this. So I'm going to push this back to, let's say 11.5 and see what we get. 10.5. Okay, that's fairly bright outside. Okay. So I'm happy with this, okay? And what I will do is actually over here in Rhino, is go to V-Ray, V-Ray lights, and put in a rectangle light, okay? So I'm gonna roughly click here, drag it to the right, click here, and make it roughly, right? Just like ballpark the height of the window. Okay, and coming over here, what you'll see is this. There is an arrow, right? This object, this V-Ray light has an arrow direction saying that, oh, that's the direction the light is shooting, okay? So I'll kind of move it up, and you'll see there's a big bright light there, right? Rotate it 90 degrees, so it's facing inwards, okay? And kind of just like move it in. So it's just outside, and I might switch to a top view to kind of really see this. So it's just outside the pane of the windows right there. Okay, just barely outside. You can kind of change its location a little bit. Go to this sort of front view and scale it so it fits a little bit better. So I'm going to move it into the center and use the scaling grip to generally, like, it doesn't have to be super precise, but just kind of generally try to scale it a little bit better so it fills the window essentially. Okay. All right, so that's in place. Now, kind of one funny thing you might see here is that it's a black thing, right? Because it shows up now, right? That light actually is this black thing. So under the settings for the rectangle light right here, if you go to the right under the options, we can make it invisible. So it will disappear, right? The light is invisible. Right now it's kind of filling it right there. We'll tweak the intensity here in a little bit. All right, I'm going to switch back to set view, back to my interior view, and you'll see, whoa, we're kind of being blinded, right, by the light in here. So I'm gonna put this down to something like 30, maybe still too high, 20, 5, right? And just kind of progressively go down until you start to kind of see this resolve a bit more reasonably. Maybe it's 10, right? And the goal is to kind of get a sense and see if you can get basically kind of like an even, right, smooth lighting situation for the inside, right? So I'm just kind of playing around, right, getting a feel for it. Okay, so maybe it's something like this, right? This kind of gives you a lot more diffuse light to light up the interior, right, without, and kind of maintain a sort of sense of like the secondary bounces, the light that is kind of bouncing in from the inside, from the outside. So let's stop that and see what that looks like. Again, change this back, go to 2000. Actually, maybe before we do that, well, actually the sculpture's outside so we can see it, but we'll do another one on the other side where it's dark. And 2000 RTX, normal rendering. So let that run and resolve. Now, these interiors will take longer, just because the darker the scene, the longer it takes to resolve. Okay. Now you might get a little bit like slightly unrealistic in the edges here, where like the light is kind of brighter there, right, on this edge with the sun. So it's sort of a balance, right? Trying to tweak that like rectangle light so that it doesn't, you know, overpower the actual sunlight, but brings enough light into the scene. But as you can see, and it's finished. As you can see, like you're getting kind of nice diffuse shadows, lighting up the interior, right? So this is kind of a shortcut or a trick, let's say, right, to simulate enough light coming in to kind of lighten an interior, just so that it doesn't get overly dark. Okay, all right. So that's that. On the other hand, let's say I'm going to, so I have another side of this room, right? And I'm going to switch back again, right? So change this back to 800 smaller preview, change it back to CPU and interactive rendering, right? Activate that. All right, so I'm going to set my view to interior 2 over here. Now, interior 2, you might have to scroll forward just one tick, just a little bit. This view, I think by default got kind of semi set in the wall, right? So just like move forward. And it should be in a view that you see basically kind of some of the light from the other side coming through this wall, but it's mostly pitch black, okay? So what we're gonna do is actually go through just to show you, right? Not really kind of do anything too much with them, just show you some of the other lights that V-Ray has. So under V-Ray lights, we'll have things like a spotlight, which I can plop in. Oh, no, sorry, not the spotlight. Let's start with the, and these all have their icons here. I'm just used to looking at this. Point light, which is an infinitely small point, and it will come in, it's omni light. You'll have to like probably add 2 zeros to the end of this intensity for it to kind of really show up, right? So you'll see that's kind of invisible, right? It's infinitely small, but it just casts light in all directions. Okay, and you can change the parameters, the color, intensity, all this sort of stuff. How does it decay? If there's no decay, then it will be really strong, right? Basically, if there's no fall off in the light, then it just kind of keeps on going and illuminates. So if you really wanted to get a very even lighting in the scene, then you could do this, right? Just no decay and do like 1, you know, something like this, you would get something that looks like that, right? But you'll see these shadows coming off of it, right? I tend not to use these omni lights too much. Again, a lot of these options, you can actually deactivate shadows so it doesn't cast shadows, right? So as an option to really just illuminate, but no decay is very kind of unrealistic, right? It will look a little fake, right? Typically you're working with inverse square, right? So it will look like that. There is a, where is it? Sphere light, which you can kind of set how big it is. So these are kind of good for, let's say, hanging pendants, right? Lights that actually have a physical presence and can change the color. So if I change the color, and again, I tend to use the Kelvin meter here to change colors for things, right? So if it's kind of more a yellow light, then that's what that will look like. So for sure, you can change it, make it invisible, just like the others, right? These options are all, kind of there, right? Its size, you can also change the size, make it bigger, smaller here, right? So, you just can play with some of these options. All right. Now, you'll see in the scene, we have these kind of, right, wall washing lights, right? So here, what I'm going to do, and this is why I changed the wireframe so I can kind of see this a little bit better, is I'm going to do some spotlights. So spotlights first is the base of the cone. So where we're shooting at, I'm just going to roughly kind of do that, pick a size and pick a direction. And I'm actually going to try to snap to the center of this. So I might have to turn on the center snap, try to snap to the center of this cone. Okay. And don't worry, we can adjust this afterwards. So by clicking it, right, you'll see that there is a target point. So if I drag this target point, then the cone follows it, right? So I can kind of get to maneuver to a position where, like, okay, this is kind of roughly, right, in plan, roughly where it is. And I can manipulate this in section. So it's sort of like maybe washing directionally, like looks like it is in the direction of the light fixture, roughly, right? So that would be kind of what that looks like, all right? So now that's probably a little dark, and I think sometimes like this happens, right? If it's not showing up, right, you might have to just like move it slightly outward. Right now it's kind of embedded inside the cylinder geometry, so just move it out a tick, just like that. Okay, and let's play with the intensity here a little bit. Let's see if this spotlight shouldn't be that dark. Okay, so I'm adding 2 zeros to the end of that just to kind of get it to show up a little bit better. Right now, this is something we can change, of course. Okay, so that's kind of like the wall washer lights, right? And what I'm going to do is actually to select it again and kind of go into a top view. You can switch to the top view if you want. It might be easier. Okay. Oh, and so you can kind of see this is slightly on an angle. So let's maybe target point and just like slide it so it's more parallel. Okay. All right. Select that. Alt drag. So hold down the Alt key and drag using the green arrow to duplicate these. So I'm going to do a bunch of them, like in series, to best I can. It doesn't have to be super accurate, but we're just doing this. Alt drag, Alt drag, Alt drag. Okay. So that's one whole row. Now, what's really nice about this is that you notice that we've done a bunch of lights, but there's still only one spotlight, meaning that these are all clones. So if I change the parameters for one, all of them change together. I don't have to go through and click them one by one. Okay, so I'll go back. Let's take a look. So now you can see we have a wall, right, with these wall washing spotlights. Great. Again, let me go back to the top and actually maybe the side, and just select them all together, right? Again, just select them all together, and I have another row on the other side, right? So again, I'll just Alt drag these guys over here, rotate them 180, basically flip them around, and then pull them roughly, right? These are slightly offset, so roughly into position where they would correlate in plan, and kind of double check my work here, right? So same thing on the other side. Okay, very easy. All right, Set view, interior 2. Again, I kind of have to like slide forward, scroll forward a tick just to get into the inside. And then we kind of look at this and say, okay, well, let's tweak this, right? Now it's still a little dark overall. And again, like sometimes like what I'll do, and we can kind of run this just as is, right? Sometimes what I'll do is actually, again, use the rectangle light trick for these. So I'll come out, add another V-Ray light, rectangle light, and make this one basically kind of like the ceiling, roughly, the size. So go horizontal first, and then this direction. This is going to be kind of facing upwards in this case, right? You'll have to kind of see what happens with yours, right? But so flip this 180, so it's shooting downwards, and you can kind of see this probably better in the section, and you just slide it down just enough so it's just below the ceiling plane of the roof, so it's there. Okay, set view, interior 2. Scroll in a bunch. Okay. So now, obviously, this has blown it out completely. So this second rectangle light, I'm actually just going to do 1. Don't forget to make it invisible. And you can kind of change this, right? Change this value based on like how much of this, how much kind of like overall lighting, right, you want this to get, right? So this should be a pretty low value. It doesn't have to be too high, right? Now, another thing is that it looks like a grayscale image right now because the lighting is just, black and white, So I would definitely change the color value, the color tone or the temperature for these. So let's say for the rectangle light, I'm going to click on this color texture and like move it a little bit in the blue direction, a little bit like that. Okay, so this will come out a little bit cooler tone, like fluorescent lights, and won't look so monochrome. Okay, and then for my spotlights, I change this into kind of more yellow-ish tone, like this, right? So you'll get that. Okay, so you'll see, like, if your lights are perfectly white, which is very difficult, but perfectly white, they'll look kind of unrealistic. You need to kind of give them a tone, right? Which is why the other renderings from the sun and the sky all have like different tones of blue or red or yellow to them, right? So this will work that way. Okay, as a final thing, I'm gonna copy this guy, make a copy, scale it down, I don't know, 0.5, make it smaller, and stick it in here somewhere as well. Set view, interior 2. I keep on forgetting to update this view. Oh, that's in the ground. So let's move this sub-D guy up. So, I mean, you can kind of use maybe use a side view to make sure that it's above ground. Something like that, barely touching. Okay, so that's that endurance, right? And if I wanted to, okay, again, like go to my materials. Oh, no. Textures. Go to my materials and change this into silver polished. Apply to selection. The silver doesn't stand out as much, although the reflections might work pretty well. Or maybe the copper. Let's try the copper. Oh yeah, okay, there you go. All right, interior 2, slide forward a hair. Okay, so I think I'm maybe relatively happy with that. So I'll stop my rendering, right? Go back to my options tab, change this to 2000, normal rendering, RTX, normal. So it will start to render. this interior, fully interior shot with wall washer lights like a gallery. Now you can turn off the rectangle light and kind of see what it does, just because like, sometimes this will look a little bit more unnatural and things are floaty just because there's so much like ambient light that the invisible rectangle light gives, right? But it does kind of light up the scene much better overall, right? But you get a lot less kind of highlights and contrast, right? So, feel free to kind of play around with options. Just like darker scenes will take longer to render. So this is finished, so we might as well kind of play with that. Let's see, if I go to my lighting and let's say if I disable this rectangle light that I had earlier, right, and we'll just see how that works out. So you see like the tone of the scene, right, completely changes, but it would be a little bit more realistic, right? So like it will also kind of take a little longer just because these bounces are coming off from, the bounces of these wall washer lights that are bouncing around the scene. Okay, now my walls are kind of default Rhino material, so these would actually pick up better if it was a V-Ray white material. But I think the scene also kind of reflects the overall brightness of these lights as well. So we can kind of tweak that. So maybe these guys don't have to be 10,000, let's say 5,000. And let's see how that updates. Now, as long as your renderings are running this fast, right, then I think, there's no problem, but you just like tweak the settings so that when you're doing test renderings, like it doesn't take forever, Okay. But honestly, in this case, some of these cases, I kind of like having the rectangle light in there because it does, set a slightly kind of different tone to things. So I'll just restart that with the rectangle light activated, right? And if it's really over bright, I can come back and kind of just like tweak this exposure value a little bit, right? Like if I feel like that's getting kind of too over bright, then I can just come back and play with the exposure value. So nine, too bright, so I should probably go like 12. Right now, you just have to kind of, with some experience, you'll kind of get a sense of like how it clears out when you actually do the final rendering, like how the noise wants to clear out. Okay. But yeah, I think that's kind of generally, you probably could put a spotlight on top of this to light this thing up. But that's kind of generally it. Let me try that really quick. So V-Ray, spotlight, something around the base here. So again, like these points can be changed fairly easily. The target point, can move it around. Can also change the cone itself as well here. So this cone angle, if I've highlighted, you'll see, for example, the cone angle, umbra angle gets bigger, smaller, right? The cone, the spread, right, can be controlled here, right? Let's see, just for fun. View, interior 2, forward. Okay, so I need to, I forgot to bump that light up. A bit, and it's probably clipping into the ceiling at the moment. Let's see. Yeah. So I need to move this down enough so it's not in the ceiling. I see. That's doing. Right, so you can kind of adjust these to make this wider. So it kind of lights that up. It depends on kind of how strong you want it to be with these like different fall offs and shadow radius, all these sort of options. Blah, blah. Okay, maybe I'll make this like really bright. Oop. Okay, there you go. So that's kind of maybe a bit more exaggerated. You can see that. You can see this shadow here in the center, right? So, okay. And let's try to render that at full size. I would probably move this so it's not doing that on the ceiling, basically. Because the cone is so wide that it's hitting part of the ceiling, but I'll probably move that so it doesn't do that, but basically kind of looking for this kind of effect here. Okay, I think that's it. That's the kind of gist of this. We're just asking you for, right, an exterior render and an interior render like this, right? Or you can give us all three, right? All three kind of scenarios that I just showed, and that's it.